Welcome to Woke Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Stanford. As a physicist and structural engineering training with Jacobs Engineering, I've made many connections with some bright individuals who are either working, studying, or self-taught and passionate about our particular topics of discussion. Today's topic focuses on plastics. For a lot of people out there, the material of plastics is an unconscious substance that we use in nearly every application during the day. For this episode, my guest stars and I intend to open your eyes to the world of plastics. We all know how convenient they can be, but what you will find out through the course of this podcast is what plastics truly are, the global trends of plastics from their invention to today, the effects that plastics have on our ecosystems, and then finally, we will plan to round out the episode with some special advice on how to mitigate our plastic consumption without hurting our banks. And now I would like to introduce my cast, starting with first Greg Dayley. Greg stumbled into the beauty industry by accidentally building one of the largest hair-related accounts on Instagram. Since that time, he has owned and sold a product company featured on Shark Tank. He has co-founded an ocean cleanup organization and recently started a hair care company called Seabar that makes disposable plastic-free hair care and picks up ocean trash with every item sold. Today, his focus is on reducing the impact of the beauty industry on the environment, which is very noble. And you can find Seabar, his company, on Instagram at Seabar Cleans. And you can also find his ocean cleanup organization at Pavati Ocean Pickup on Instagram as well. My second guest is Jeremy Conkle. Jeremy is an associate professor in the Department of Physical and Environmental Science at Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi. He earned his dual bachelor's degrees in biology and chemistry at Longwood University. He also achieved an MS in environmental studies from the College of Charleston and a Ph.D. in Oceanography and Coastal Sciences from Louisiana State University. He was also a Postdoctoral Scholar at University of California Riverside. His research focuses on contaminant presence, along with fate and impacts in aquatic systems. Dr. Conkle's current research relates to plastic debris in rivers and coastal settings. This includes work quantifying microplastics in the Mississippi River and their discharge to the Gulf of Mexico. He also studies microplastics in Texas rivers and bays, along with the microplastic consumption by blue crabs. And last but not least, Maysa Albahri. Maysa is majoring in electrical engineering with a focus on power systems at Western Sydney University in Australia. Her intent is to focus on green and sustainable energy sources to combat climate change. Maysa is an active climate change advocate on social media and is posting daily interactive and enlightening information to the public at large. Her plan is to influence people into becoming more sustainable and practicing their environmental consciousness. You can find Maysa on Instagram at CZG_electrical_engineer. So I hope that got you excited, because when we come back from our first commercial break, we plan to introduce plastics and talk about how they became a mainstream trend from invention to now. So stay tuned. We are rolling here at Woke Talk Podcast, and for the first segment, we thought it would be important to kick off the episode by laying the foundational information of plastics. So what is plastic? Plastic is a substance that is made of polymer chains, which are just large molecules of the same repeated substance. So plastics are usually referred to by man-made materials, while other substances such as wool, protein, and silk all actually fall into that same category and considered as plastics. So plastics on a material standpoint are absolutely superb. Plastics, when made, are highly workable and moldable due to its low mending temperatures, and it makes it easy to form whatever product is manufactured. Now, they are also highly resilient and do not break down as easily as most other products. Most other products, such as aluminum, paper, and tin, biodegrade through natural processes, but plastics that are synthetic continuously break down into smaller and smaller components, which are noted in mainstream information as microplastics. So Plastic products weren't always made from synthetic components. Before 1907, plastics were only made from natural components like the silk and celluloid that was mentioned before. So that all changed with the invention of Bakelite. Bakelite was made from phenol, a product of coal tar and a concentration of formaldehyde, the same substance that we flood humans with upon a funeral viewing. But this was the spark that ignited scientists of the early 20th century to invent synthetic plastic. After synthetic plastics, polyester was invented in 1920 for the use of insulation. And then came vinyl that was created and used in many applications, but most well known for scratch records that conveyed music and messages. To round out the 20s, acrylics were also developed then to mimic glass. Once the 30s kind of rolled around, we saw nylon, a plastic that revolutionized the clothing industry. And finally, polyethylene. Polyethylene is still highly utilized today in most things that you can think of: plastic bags, shampoo bottles, deodorant containers, and much more. Just like most consumer products, military usage propelled its availability. I don't care what you proclaim, whether it's radios or piezoelectric materials, plastics, everything is propelled by the government and by military usage. So scientists developed plastics to provide more affordable products to the public at large. And with the help of World War II, plastic production boomed and became the norm. There were plastic grocery bags, plastic wrap, plastic gloves, improved and sterile medical technology, containers that made food and other goods last longer, and just much more, like anything you could think of. It ultimately made life more convenient, and that's the truth. Synthetic plastics can be broken down into two forms. There's single-use plastics, and then there's multi-use plastics. Today, though, single-use plastics account for 90% of the plastics produced worldwide, which is insane. Yes, they are convenient and cost-effective, but with all decisions come consequences. So plastics are made of non-renewable resources that are deemed synthetic. Increased production comes at the cost of using these non-renewable resources and a surmounting carbon footprint. These synthetics are made from natural gas and oil. As mentioned before, plastics are in almost all daily products, from toiletries all the way to food storage. This results in a mass production and overusage. So to come full circle, we face a huge plastic problem. Because these plastics are so resilient and there was so much produced for single use, there are now insane amounts floating around, so to speak. So I grabbed an article published by the BBC that reported a study done by a group of US scientists that showed we have produced nearly 8.3 billion metric tons of plastic worldwide since 1950, which could cover the entire country of Argentina. And, you know, the country of Argentina is pretty massive. It's the 8th largest country in the world. Yikes. Scientists deem that we are now living in the plastics century. Now, I could charm you with more facts about how much we humans have polluted Earth with plastics, but instead I thought we could switch gears and give you a different perspective. So I have a treat for you. And originally I was going to talk for this whole segment, but then I ran across Greg Dayley. And Greg is the founder of Pavati Ocean Pickup. And I don't want to throw out any spoilers about his organization, but I can tell you he is the perfect person to come on and talk about what is going on today in our environment in relation to plastic. So thanks for being on the show, Greg. Would you mind first telling us about Pavati Ocean Pickup?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited for this. So Pavati Ocean Pickup really started as a pandemic project, is what I call it. So when everything started to go into lockdown in 2020, some friends and I were like, let's pick up 1,000 pounds of ocean trash. And so we started doing that. And my sister posted something about it on Instagram, or on Facebook rather. And she used to live in the Philippines and has a whole bunch of friends in the Philippines. And as we were picking up trash, we were going out almost every day, picking up trash and getting kind of obsessed about it. And then this friend, it's so random. It could only happen on Facebook. It's like my sister's friend's sister's husband or something like that, like really random connection, reaches out to my sister first, actually. And I was like, oh, I would like to help with this somehow. And we're like, cool. And so we pulled together some money, some of our money, and we paid him to hire a crew in the Philippines and pick up trash. And the beach behind me there is what they picked up. It's this little strip of land. I don't know, maybe 100 yards long by 50 yards wide, like a little triangle. And over the course of a week, they pulled out a little over 30,000 pounds of trash.
Wow.
From that little beach. It's pretty crazy. I'll send you a picture of the after. Like this is like when they first started. The after, they could probably have pulled out another couple, like maybe 500 to 1,000 pounds out of it after they were done. But it was just kind of in the mud and in the muck, and I don't know. Jeez. We didn't have enough money to keep paying them.
No, just decades of having trash being compacted down.
Totally. And all the locals were like, this is the cleanest we've ever seen this.
Wow.
So that's kind of how it started. So now we pick up trash in Washington State, where I'm based. And then the lady who I started with, Annie, she's based in Maine. And she picks up over there. She's a lot more regular. When I go out, I usually go out and pick up like a few 100 pounds. I go big. She goes out every day. She's really dedicated. You can see her stuff on our Instagram page, Pavati Ocean Pickup. But yeah, and so kind of to speak about the stuff that we find is we find a lot of really consumer products is what we find a lot of. Now, we find a lot of fishing gear too. And if you've seen that show Seaspiracy, they talk a lot about the trash that we find, like the fishing trash that we find.
Yeah.
And we find, like, she's based in Portland, Maine, which is obviously a lobstering community. I'm Bellingham, Washington, salmon and crab. So they are fishing their active dock areas. Like, these aren't like tourist beaches type areas as much. They are, what do they call them? Active waterfronts, I guess.
Yeah.
And so we find quite a bit of fishing gear. And by weight, it's probably equals the amount of, because they're like big things, like we'll get a whole net or like a full crab pot that's washed up again, or so we find quite a bit of that. And so but the consumer stuff, I think, is underrepresented, because if you think about most of the fishing gear, like most of it's designed to float.
Right.
And there's I don't remember the exact number, but something like 70% of all the trash that goes in the ocean just sinks straight to the bottom and never comes out again. And obviously that's going to be the stuff that doesn't float.
Right.
And so we don't find the stuff that doesn't float, like that doesn't come back out. But what we do find, we find a lot of bottles and cans, like you would imagine. But we don't find very many plastic bags or things like that. Like if it's like a limp plastic, I guess, like it sinks to the bottom. We don't find as many of those. But the things that really surprised me, the things that I guess I didn't expect to find, like I expected to find the disposable items that you throw away after one use, because everybody sees those on the ground. Yeah. But the stuff that I didn't expect to find were like the durable goods, I guess, that you expect people to throw away properly. Like, you wouldn't believe the number of shoes that I find. Like, we find so many shoes and flip-flops. Like, I put together, well, there's some videos that I'll send you. Like, I started taking pictures or little videos of me picking up all these shoes and sandals, and they're just all over the place. I started collecting them, and I've got like a couple of 5-gallon buckets full of shoes that I collected just over a couple of times in this one little strip of land. And the other one is tennis balls, presumably from people playing fetch with their dogs. But these kind of these durable products, I guess, got me thinking about the whole supply chain and like the whole factor of recyclability. And we've been told for years about, we got to recycle. And the background of the recycling industry is really based, like modern recycling started in the 60s and 70s when garbage started piling up. And the birth of the modern recycling movement can really be traced back to this ad that they ran, really successful ad called the Crying Indian ad. And you can look it up on YouTube. Yeah. We'll put aside for a second that the actor is actually Italian, but but he's crying about all of this garbage. And the end line is something along the lines of like, humans made pollution, humans can clean it up. But the kind of the underside, all of that good messages, like it's true. But the underside of it is the ad was paid for by the Keep America Beautiful Foundation, which was founded by a large coalition of bottlers. So these bottling companies didn't want to be blamed essentially for the garbage that was piling up. Like before, your milk bottles and your soda bottles, you return them for a deposit.
Right.
And they washed it and used it again, right? And that cost a lot of money. Once plastic came on the scene, your milk and your soda and whatever could just be put in these bottles that cost them a couple of cents, and then they could be disposed of, and who cares? They were so cheap.
Oh yeah.
And so there's been this concerted effort to pin recycling as the solution to our problems, because recycling falls on the consumer end. And it conveniently and very deliberately shifts that burden from the producers to the consumers.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, only 9% of what we do globally is recycled. Out of the 9 billion metric tons of produced plastic that we made since 1950, it's an insanely small amount. And also, if you recycle things, you only get certain amount of uses until it's disposed of anyways. So it doesn't really answer the problem at all on a very minuscule scale.
And the reason that recycling doesn't work, like recycling does work for products that are worth recycling.
Yeah, like glass.
Metals.
Well,
glass is great to recycle, but the colors start throwing in a bunch of problems. Like glass is infinitely recyclable, but it's really difficult to recycle. So I put together this graph here that you can see like kind of the recycling rates based on material, plastic versus paper versus metals. And I'm drawing a blank. I don't have it in front of me right now, but we'll put that up on the screen, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But just plastic recycling is abysmally low. It's like 9%, like you were saying, versus paper, which is up in the 60%. That's because recycled paper is actually valuable. Recycled plastic is not valuable. It's cheaper to make new paper or new plastic than it is to recycle plastics. Again, significantly cheaper. And if it wasn't, if recycling worked, if it was valuable, then the recycling rates would be up like it is with paper. It's economics.
Oh yeah.
And
with these food grade safe plastics, the reason why it's food safe is because it's made of multi-layer plastics. So it's really, really difficult to separate. That's why it's so expensive.
Yeah. And I don't know if you saw all the hullabaloo about the tetracycle. You see a lot of like those, like if you buy like the ultra pasteurized milk or almond milk or something in those Tetra packs.
Yeah.
Like on the back, they have these like recyclable stuff, but you have to send it away. There's this whole thing. There's a bunch of articles about it. You can link to it in the show notes or something, but about how this is basically just a scam. Like they're not really recyclable. They recycle a very small percentage of them and then they stop accepting it. Like they're like, the company who makes this pays us a certain amount to recycle, X number of these tubes and bottles. And then we don't recycle anymore because it's insanely expensive. And we can't recycle our way out of it. The only way we can solve this problem of plastic and garbage piling up in the ocean is to not use it in the first place, is to look for products and options that don't use disposable plastic. Like plastic is a miracle substance.
Oh
It
yeah.
really is. It's amazing. But we should be
Mhm.
saving it and treating it as the valuable product it is. Right now, the costs of disposal of plastic are externalized. They're put into the environment. If
Yep.
we were paying the
Yep.
true cost of plastic, it would cost, I'm making this number up, but several times what they cost now.
Oh yeah. Oh, I
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, there needs to be some sort of producer pushback. I mean, they have to be responsible for what they put out there. I've seen recollection programs of which, the where it's kind of government implemented, where these producers are responsible. They produce the product. So say like Coca-Cola, they sell you a pack of Coke or like a liter of Coke. Well, then they're responsible then to collect that from the consumer and then reintroduce that into their manufacturing process, and then boom, it's like it's just reusing rather than recycling or throwaway society. But
Which there's already a system for that. They did
oh
it for
yeah.
hundreds of, well, I don't know, hundreds, but 100 years, they did that exact same thing. It's
Oh
not
yeah.
like it's not possible. It just costs more money than they're willing to pay. And it increases the price of their product,
Yep.
which decreases demand. And they don't
Mhm.
want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, the last time we had a system in which the government was like, listen, we need you to recycle everything, your gas, your rubber, your just all the bottles, everything that you kind of consume. That was World War II. And
Yeah,
right after World War II, we got into the plastics era, which created the plastic century that we're in now. It's crazy. And, if I may, it is an endless cycle of government implementation. Without a stern approach to sanctioning these producers who supply single-use plastics to the public, it's hard to right the ship. I mean, if you don't correct bad behavior, it becomes an unconscious act, right? I mean,
absolutely.
yeah, I mean, governments, they mandate education reform, right? And then educational systems then inform students. Well, what are the students? The students become the producers and the lawmakers. Then lawmakers run the government, and producers continue to supply the same goods and continue the downward trend. So without education teaching us environmental ethics, that is mandated by the government, it's hard to create any sense of change.
Absolutely. And not greenwashing it through, like right now, they only teach recycling. They
Yep.
have to teach more.
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, let's be honest. Recycling is literally bottom tier. It's reduce
Absolutely.
and reuse, just making conscious decisions. And they don't teach to make conscious decisions about it. That's why it's unconscious. We don't even think about it in everything. But I mean, hey, I get it. Companies make decisions based on money and education. So if it doesn't hurt their pockets, it's okay. And if they are informed on the impacts of their products and what they can do to minimize that impact, then there would be a really good cause for change. I totally understand, but, and we also have to think about it this way, because we talked about government and the producers. So it's not
Yeah.
really a linear problem. Everything's always dynamic. It's going to take all sectors of life. I mean, you're going to have to, for one, the consumers, we do have to make conscious purchases after we get informed. And we have to also vote appropriately. We have to have people in, not even just the president, the whole way from top to bottom, that people are conscientious about a green movement. And then, we also just have to lobby for change. If we sit here at our computers, we're not really doing anything. We have to get out and we have to, picket, we have to protest, we have to, invoke change. Secondly, like I said, government officials, they have to mandate these laws to make producers change their business models and correct educational systems to teach environmental ethics. And then finally, what you're preaching, and I'm 100% about it, is producers. I mean, they have to follow through. They have to follow through in an economical and sustainable manner. This
Yeah.
approach, I can see humans actually righting the ship. It has to be everybody coming together, which is really tough. I literally thought COVID was going to be the unification of people. I really did, but it still ceases to amaze me. But
Yeah.
we create the problem, and subsequently we will have to conjure up a solution. And it's, yes, still continue to recycle. I feel like we badmouth recycling. We still have to recycle,
Agreed,
Yeah,
totally.
we
There's
have to
nothing,
put,
it's not
yeah,
bad, but
no.
it's bottom tier, like you just said. It's
Yeah.
the last resort.
Oh yeah, and I'm a big fan of AI. A lot of people are against AI. A lot of people are scared of AI. I hope AI can also help us, because instead of humans sitting there sorting through, mindless amounts of trash on conveyor belts, they can easily sift through colors. So like how you say glass. Glass is an issue because of colors. Well, what if we have a system in which, oh, that's green glass, push. That's red, push. It's brown, push. It's clear, push it to the side, and then it goes to an appropriate space. Someday, if we keep recycling and if we keep reducing and keep reusing, things will get better. We just have to tackle the problem with a little bit of technology and a little bit of education. But
Yeah, and committing to it financially, because all of these things cost money. And we have to decide that we're not going to externalize those costs onto the ocean and the environment anymore.
oh yeah, like you said, if we actually appropriated the correct costs on plastics, we'd be changing business models every day. If it was appropriately cost, just like water, it would be a huge change.
Yeah.
But I kind of want to finish out. I mean, the great news is that there are states and countries at large who are banning single-use plastics. Have you heard about like all the stuff that Canada's been doing lately, especially this year?
Yeah, they've been taking some big steps.
Yeah.
I'm interested to see how it actually pans out.
Yeah.
Like the definition of single-use plastic by some people is very literal. I think it's like that might not include a milk jug because you use it 5 times. Like I'm afraid that it's going to get greenwashed in that sense. So I hope that they stick to their guns and actually, like, if something's doesn't need to be plastic, if there's not like a massive incentive for it to be, like, syringes or something that needs to be perfectly sterile, blood bags or something like that. Like, I'm fine with plastic there, or plastic that gets used for a decade in a car. I can see that being beneficial, because then it's a big enough sheet and it's a single size and it's easy to recycle and all that stuff. It's I think you used it best, like the mindless consumption of it.
Yep.
We've been trained not to even think about it. My grandma used to wash out Ziploc bags. And
I do.
I do now, but we teased her about it. We were like, "Oh, that's funny, Grandma. You're so quirky, funny, depression aged or era grandma." But like, we couldn't have been more wrong.
Oh yeah. I mean, I've done everything I could to ban plastics out of my life, and I've made it a conscientious decision to literally think about everything that I buy. Not everybody does that, and it's also hard. It's a lot of effort. So it as you can say, it falls on the producers. If there were more choices, it would be so easy for me to go zero waste. It'd be so easy for me. I mean, but we face plastic grocery bags, we face straws, we face bottles, we face to-go food containers, wrappers. I mean, it's just all over the place, and there's pushback. And you're right, there is a fine gray area. I think we need a committee to just sit down and be like, listen, lawmakers, this is what single use is, but medical technology, sterile, important, vaccinations, we need that. But we don't need grocery bags. We don't need Ziploc bags. We don't need straws. There's the things of need and want. Need and want. It's totally different. Look up the definition. It's totally different. It's totally different. But like I said, shout out to Canada. I mean, shout out to a lot of countries out there. I mean, there's over 170 countries worldwide that have jumped on the bandwagon of cutting single-use plastics by 2030. So I'm very, very pumped about the future.
I'm really optimistic about it too. It's absurd how many things get thrown away that shouldn't have been created in the first place.
Yeah. I mean, hey, look, I say this, I swear, in every episode. I mean, science is just learned failures. Science has learned failures. I mean, how else are we going to right the ship without failing first? But yeah, I mean, with time and effort, I do believe that, the US and other countries that still aren't totally on that bandwagon, they're going to cut these single-use plastics. And just imagine a world where 90% of the plastics produced disappear from our shores and waterways, our forests, and even inside of us, inside of all living organisms. I mean, 90% is throwaway plastics. And that goes all the way back to whenever it first started. And then the 10%, the 10% that's also been thrown away, that's your fishing gear. Just imagine if we changed that. I mean, what would be a better place?
And it's not really that hard, to be honest. Like in terms of like big systemic problems in the world, it's really one of the easier ones to fix, I believe, because there are viable solutions for all of the single-use plastics. There are good ones. They just cost a little bit more.
For now, until we appropriately price it.
I mean, yeah.
It's appropriately pricing, but
yep.
I agree. So whether or not there is a major movement to clean up and implement producer and governmental change, there are still underlying effects from our man-made friend, plastics. And stick around for our second segment, where we will take a deep dive into the effects that plastics have on our ecosystem. So thanks, Greg. I appreciate you being on.
Thanks so much for having me. It was fun. I like this. I can talk about this all day.
Oh, absolutely. I'll definitely have to have you back on again for sure. But for all of you watching and listening, stay tuned. Welcome to another segment of Woke Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Stanford. To kick things off, this segment will be focusing on the impacts that plastics have on our total ecosystem. For your information, an ecosystem includes all organisms and the physical environment. So instead of tackling this myself, we thought it would be best to bring in an expert. And with that being said, we were lucky enough to have connected with Dr. Jeremy Conkle. Jeremy is an associate professor in the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at Texas A&M University-Corpus Christi. Now, I mentioned his work and scholar achievements in the introduction portion, but to put his relevance into perspective, he is well equipped for this portion of the show. So thank you, Jeremy, for being on the podcast. And also thank you so much for inviting me to sit in on the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project Authority Report Out. That's a very large acronym. But for those of you wondering, that was on human and ecological health effects of microplastics in water. So thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You're welcome.
So how might our listeners reach you on social media?
So I'm on Twitter, and my handle is C_HAWQ. If you're trying to figure out what that means, it's Seahawk, as in Coastal Health and Water Quality Lab. So it's just that acronym for that. So it's C_HAWQ.
All right, well, thank you. So now let's lay the foundation, so to speak. When we think of effects on the ecosystem, what does that all imply?
It really is a broad way of thinking about things. You can think about effects that may alter the way a system functions or change the way something is occurring in a system. That can be for the negative or the positive. And then you have different layers of that, and the scale at which you think about those effects, whether it's a small system within the larger ecosystem, or organismal, thinking about the population of that species, or individual organisms or individuals within a population and their effects. So there's a lot of different layers to that when you think about an ecosystem. But yeah, those effects can be either both negative or positive.
Right. And then with respect to the plastics themselves, could you maybe elaborate on how those effects come hand in hand? I know we talked about different densities and the different types of substances that we get off of those plastics.
Yeah, plastics are not one singular item. They are comprised of many different polymers. And most of the people out there listening to this will probably understand that there's polyethylene, polypropylene are probably two of the most common. Polypropylene is used in a lot of plastic bottles. Polyethylene is what you find in a lot of other single-use packaging, so wrapping for sealing items, or in plastic bags. Those are two of probably the most common plastics that you'll find, and they are less dense than water, so they tend to float under most circumstances. And so those are the ones you typically find washed up on beaches, shorelines around of rivers, and They tend to be more common in the environment and easy to see. There's a lot of other plastics like nylon, polyethylene terephthalate, which is also polyester, and polystyrene that are more dense than water. And I know I say polystyrene there, and a lot of you think about the foam cups. That's when it's aerated. So there's polystyrene comes in multiple forms. The most common that you probably see is in, or that you recognize is in those foam cups that you get at fast food establishments, or those coolers you buy at the gas station. So that's one form. And obviously that's less dense when it's aerated, but when it's not aerated, when it's in its typical form, it is more dense than water. And one of the most common uses for that polystyrene previously, and I don't think it's used for this anymore, but was the lids on Starbucks coffee cups. So a lot of coffee cup lids, not just Starbucks, but others were polystyrene. And they may still be, I don't know if that's changed, but I know Starbucks changed their lids to their coffee cups, or some of their cups anyway. So those plastics that are more dense than water tend to be found in different places, right? Because water is the transport mechanism. Once it gets in the environment, water will distribute these materials based on density. So if they don't float, they tend to sink and they get transported in the sediment. Or if the water flow is significant enough, it will entrain some of those materials in the flow of the water and move them around the environment. So typically you find the more dense plastics outside of places that you normally look. So you don't often get to see the sediment or the bottom of a river, but that's where you would probably find more of those heavier plastics if they're there.
Oh, okay. So let's now talk about a little bit about the I guess the petrochemical aspect of what comes with these plastics whenever it's introduced into the environment or into our ecosystem.
Yeah. So plastics are this material we use for a lot of things, and those plastics come in different shapes, different sizes, and are used for many different purposes. And the list of uses is constantly expanding. And in order to get some of these plastics to better mesh or increase their usefulness, you have to add chemicals to them. Now, these chemicals aren't a part of the structure of that plastic, but they enhance the use by making it less susceptible to weathering or aging, less susceptible to bending and breaking or fracturing and cracking. And so these chemicals are added, and they kind of loosely sit within the chemical structure of the plastic and add functionality to it to increase the usefulness of those plastics. So these are things like phthalates, which are plasticizers, or DEHPs, but also you have UV inhibitors, things that reduce the effect of UV light. You also get flame retardants that will reduce or prevent things from catching fire as fast. So flame retardants tend to be more in electronics, TVs, cell phones, things like that. Not that you're exposed to them heavily when they're on your TV or anything like that, but with the phthalates, plasticizers were there to soften the plastic, make it more malleable, less likely to bend and break and crack. And so it increases the useful life of that plastic, which to some extent is good because you don't consume as much plastic that way if it lasts longer. You typically don't find a lot of those chemicals in like the grocery bags you get at like Walmart or Target or grocery stores. Those plastic bags typically don't have the plasticizers in them because they're single use. They're not intended for long-term use. And so it's not worth it to put those chemicals into those. So they're typically just the polyethylene in a sheet form that's converted to a bag. And then, that's the chemical suite that's on them when they're manufactured, if there's chemicals added. And then once these things get in the environment, plastics change, they weather, they age, you get a whole nother potential suite of contaminants that could be on them from environmental exposure. So whatever chemicals, whether they're organic chemicals or metals in the environment, some of them can absorb to the plastics. And like I said, there's different types of plastics, and their age and weathering in the environment also affects the surface of those plastics. So there's a lot of factors that go into affecting what chemicals will absorb to that. The type of plastic, its age, its weathering state, and just surface area in general. And then the chemicals that are in the environment that could stick to the plastics are also influence or dictate what will go on there, right? So the chemical properties are important. And so you have this complex series of properties that you have to consider when studying these chemicals or considering their potential effects in the environment.
Wow, that it's more intuitive than what most people would think. Definitely, they just think plastics. Well, plastics is in the ocean, so it's bad, and we're consuming them, but not nobody thinks about the whole around, I guess, dynamic situation that we're looking at.
Right.
And it makes me nervous how much we still don't know about the substances that plastics emit into our ecosystem. And thankfully, we have top researchers like yourself focusing on it. So let's kind of switch gears and talk about the physical environment and how plastics have altered our land, our air, our sea. So let's start with land, shall we?
Yeah, I think a good way to think about this is, humans live most places around the globe now, but there are still places where there are uninhabited areas where humans typically don't go very often. And for the most part, if we do go there and look for plastics, we can find them. So if you have the right tools, know what to look for, and are diligent enough, you can probably find plastic almost anywhere you look. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of having the right tools. And, obviously advanced microscopes and things like that are not always available. And, people don't want to go out and buy them just to try to find something in an area they think is clean. But you can find plastic almost everywhere. And we see studies coming out all the time about, we were on this mountain and this is how much plastic we found. And it's, like rarely anybody goes there. But it's key to think about what plastic is getting those environments. It's not like somebody dumped a garbage truck of plastic in that area. We're talking about plastics that get transported in the atmosphere for those pristine areas, or in water from upstream system to a downstream system. So those plastics are typically somehow airborne. They're light enough to get entrained in the flow of the air, and they move around the earth that way. And so these are typically really small, maybe nanoplastics in particle size, but oftentimes we think more about this plastic in the atmosphere is the fibers from our clothes and other fabrics and materials that we use in our daily lives. So the clothes we're wearing, flags, other fabrics that are out there in the environment, sails on ships, those are all constantly shedding some small amount of fibers. When you walk around, you're shedding fibers. Those potentially, some of them can get entrained in the air and flow around, get caught up in the air and move long distances. The data and the studies on this are not nearly as substantial as what we have in coastal and marine and deep ocean environments. That's where a lot of the focus on plastics research has been. But it's the researchers in atmospheric sciences and studying soil science and agriculture are really getting into this now and starting to dig into it. And you're starting to see more of those studies come out. But we definitely see plastic almost anywhere you look, especially if you go to like parks or shore, like places with shorelines or wherever water can flow. You see that accumulation both from the water, and then in parks you definitely see people littering, or stuff gets enmeshed in the soil and it kind of gets buried and you don't see it. It's kind of below the grass a little bit, and you can see it maybe sticking out of the soil. But we have a park here, Cole Park, that is notorious for plastic debris washing up because there's a couple big stormwater drains nearby, but also people in Texas in our area tend to litter a lot, and there's a lot of wind here as well. So the garbage or the trash cans kind of blow out and you get stuff all over the ground. And so you can see a lot in this park, almost like that picture behind you.
Right. And, in one good example is Easter Island, one that has a low population density, but a high density or high concentration of I guess, just accumulated plastics. You can look up pictures online for anybody who's watching or listening. For my own research, there's about 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics that have been produced since 1950. And 79%, or roughly 6.5 billion metric tons, have been actually either landfilled, dumped, or have found its way into the natural environment. So with regards to like these chemicals that you kind of touched upon earlier, don't you find this to be troubling in terms of the soil profiles with high concentrations? Because essentially that is like a gateway to leaching into groundwater and also becoming absorbed by our plant and I guess mushroom kingdoms and I guess all kingdoms really put together. And we essentially have landfills to prevent such leaching, but that's only just a small percentage. That's collective of the 79%. And then go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I think that it comes down to concentration and mass of the plastic, right? And how much of the chemicals are in there. So for, I think, a lot of consumer plastics that are single use, which is what we see a lot of in the environment, they don't necessarily have a lot of the phthalates in them or the UV inhibitors, because they're intended for a short use. So it's not worth it to put that extra chemical in it. And a lot of those single-use plastics also don't have, or are food grade plastics. So they're used for soda or water or other, food items. And so those typically don't have a lot of the plasticizer in them. Some of the fast food packaging or, microwavable dinners, meals, they have the perfluorinated compounds in them, which can be problematic. And I think they'll hopefully be on their way out in the next few years because we've learned so much about the perfluorinated compounds in the last decade. But, I don't worry about that leaching as much. It's more about the physical effect on land, I think. What does this do to the soil structure? What does it do to, potential organisms that are there in the soil? If there is some metal contamination or other organic contamination, could that be affecting some of that ecosystem as well? And could the plastics add additional stress to that? So there's a lot of variables there. I don't worry too much with some of the plastics as far as those additives that are in them. It's more about physical effects on land, I think. But there's still a lot to learn, so I could be wrong with that.
Yeah, well, those are great points. And so let's kind of go, I guess, to the waterways, because I know you can unpack a lot of information based on this realm of plastic effects. So please enlighten us.
Yeah, in water is where most research has been done, especially in kind of coastal and marine systems. Freshwater systems are starting to receive a lot more attention. And there's some great researchers at University of Loyola in Chicago that are just got a grant to do some work looking at how plastic debris moves throughout a watershed and what things kind of capture and trap it and cause it to be kind of sequestered there versus what conditions allow it to flow freely downstream. And so that's one of the big questions, is how is this material getting from upstream to downstream environments, and how much is being sequestered? Because we can measure what is in a system in the water and then what comes out, but you're missing a lot on the shorelines. And I think that's a really important aspect, because you can have, sampling under normal conditions and you measure a certain amount, but then you might get these flush events that take that stuff that is accumulated on the shorelines and really flush it out of that stream or that river in one large event. And that's where you can get, these really terrible visuals of all this trash going downstream. And that includes the smaller microplastics as well. And so we know that within those systems that a lot of this plastic debris is accumulating on the shorelines. What I don't think we know as much about is how that's affecting sedimentation and soil structure on those shores. Does it make the shorelines less stable? And I think you could probably maybe make some arguments for that, especially with things like the Nitex chip bags. And when you get potato chips, those bags are really hard to open and rip, right? And those bags are really resistant to degradation, but they tend to end up in water bodies sometimes, and that can affect soil structure. But maybe they just have the same kind of structure as leaves or something, but we just don't know those things. And so it'll be interesting to see how plastic debris accumulating on shorelines affects the stability of those shorelines over time. And as that stuff moves to the coast, it goes out of river mouths and streams, and then accumulates on beaches and shorelines around the world. And with that, I haven't seen a whole lot of studies there looking at the potential for physical effects on the ecosystem. One of the only, or I think there's a couple papers on this now that hypothesize that because plastics have different heat capacities, which is the ability to basically absorb heat, they heat up differently than the sediment on a beach. Mm-hmm. And that sediment on a beach may heat up more or less. I can't remember what it was, but I think the sediment gets hotter. And in places like Texas here, where we get a lot of debris from the Gulf of Mexico that washes up on our beaches, and we also have a lot of sea turtle nesting sites, especially for endangered species that have been really looked over for the last couple of decades to try to get them back up and recovered to a degree. And those turtles are struggling still, but they're starting to come back. We're starting to see more of them. But the question is, if you have this plastic debris washing up on your beaches and it mixes with the sand and it affects the heat storage capacity of the soil during the day, that could affect the sex of sea turtles, because sea turtle eggs, the sex of sea turtles are typically, or at least, I don't know if it's all species, but some species are determined by temperature. And so if those temperatures aren't at the right range, you might get all of one sex or the other. And so I haven't seen that actually identified in the wild, but I've seen studies that talk about that and have looked at plastic debris on beaches as a potential problem for that, or to affect those sea turtles in that way.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's something that you don't hear of every day. Wow. That's really
right.
good
And those
information.
are some of the bigger, species level, but also ecosystem, right? They change some dynamic in the system and alter it in a way that could harm a species.
That makes so much sense. I didn't even think about the heat sink, or the heat sink, I guess, effect of having all these plastics within
Yeah,
I guess,
some
the
of my favorite studies are the ones where you're like, well, damn, that makes a lot of sense. Why didn't I think of that?
Wow.
So, and that's a great example, right? Plastics, they don't heat up as much, or they don't absorb as much heat as a mineral grain of sand.
Right. And I guess I'm sure you're probably pretty familiar with this. A lot of these plastic producing companies are now understanding what's going on with the water that we need to use and consume, because a lot of these companies, they are petrochemicals, so they have to have clean potable water, fresh water to make these plastics. So where are they moving to? They're moving to the Great Lakes.
They're moving to shipping routes where they can ship and receive materials efficiently. Here, like up there, I think near you, but also down here in Texas, we have a lot of, we have two of the largest polyethylene plants in the world that are either just opening up or about to open up.
Yep. I see hiring signs actually all the time whenever I go up to my family camp up in Lake Erie, and they're all over the place. We're hiring. And I've been watching a lot of videos, not even just Lake Erie, but also Lake Ontario, where they're just setting up all over the place. And they're a major drain on, I guess, society's, effectiveness of being able to have clean, potable water. So it's kind of scary. Watch the beach lines. I've seen actually a lot of microplastics build up within the last couple of years.
Once you start seeing them, you'll notice them every time, because it literally looks like colorful confetti in the rack line on the beach. So that high tide line, you'll see it. And it's just, there's blues and greens and reds just mixed in. And once you see it, it's just everywhere.
It's unseeable. Yeah. So that is some very valuable information that you've been providing. And as it has been established, this is kind of a directly correlated trickle effect, just like what you were talking about with the turtles. And plastics are emitted into the environment along with these attached industrial chemicals that translate from their said functions. And then the living organisms of the earth, which represent all kingdoms, come into contact with these macro and micro plastics, even nano, I guess all sizes really, predominantly these microplastics, and they ingest them one way or another. So let's kind of talk about some of the effects on living organisms, if you may.
Yeah, so like we started off talking about, plastics are really diverse, and the workshop that you I think listened to a little bit this morning talked about the struggles in trying to tease out what matters the most when it comes to exposures of these plastics. And I think listening to that, the biggest thing that I took away was that and it's something I always tell my students in my classes, like, if you don't know the answer, probably the answer is it depends. And there are so many variables that it's going to depend on the individual variables and details of that specific thing you're trying to measure or understand. So, for example, in some of the research, it looked like size of the particles at low concentration. So larger particles at low concentrations had the greatest effect, but then also the opposite was true. A lot of small particles also had a really large effect. So it's not really clear yet when you see these effects. So it's going to come down to individual circumstances, organisms, environmental conditions, plastic type, plastic shape, whether it's a particle or a fragment or a sphere versus a fiber. All those things play into the effects you're going to see. And it's so variable, and it's really hard to pinpoint what's the best way to talk about it and not seem biased in one way. Yeah. But a paper by Chelsea Rockman's group up at the University of Toronto, they updated a paper they put out 6 years ago now, almost 6 years ago now. They updated it last year, where they basically did a meta-analysis of all the toxicology and effects studies that they could find that had reliable data. And to give you an example of some of the categories of effects that they saw in that data, was basically they had, there were some of the categories that had the most effect at the suborganismal level were macromolecule damage, like DNA damage, protein damage from exposure to microplastics. But the caveat is like, so out of those studies, there were 36 effects that were found, but there were also 38 effects not found. So that's why it gets into the complexity of this, is that there's a lot of material here and a lot of variables, and how you control those variables and under what conditions do you test will really help to tease out what effects you're going to see. And so there's a lot of studies that show positive effect or show some kind of effect, and then there's a lot of studies that found no effect. And there are a lot of studies that also are not necessarily comparable either, because their methods don't mesh well, or aren't comparable, or they weren't environmentally relevant concentrations they observed or used in their dosing. So there's a lot of differences there. Another example is here with organisms reduced growth or death. So they found there's 75 studies that had, or 75 effects from microplastics, 59 effects from macroplastics, but then there are 96 studies or effects that weren't found or weren't observed that they were testing for in microplastics. So it really does depend on the organism, but in general, the types of things that you see tend to be like inflammation, protein damage, cell damage, that kind of stuff from exposure. Inflammation, if you eat something that's not what you should be eating, it can upset your stomach, right?
Right.
So same thing in smaller organisms. At the ecological level, so the larger level, the ecosystem level, the example here is there's increase or decrease of population. So there's 28 studies that showed a decrease or increase or decrease due to microplastics, 24 due to macroplastics, but then 44 found no effect. So it really is specific to organisms and their environment, and it's really difficult to kind of tease out those and talk about them in a broad scale at this point, because there's so much diversity in the materials and the testing. And that's one of the biggest struggles in this field right now, is how do you compare across studies, and is it apples to apples or apples to oranges? And that's a big struggle, and a lot of there's been a lot of work going into figuring out how to synthesize studies, but harmonize methods so that they can compare across studies and environments.
Sounds like it's just in the baby stages.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And
years of work, but still in baby stages. The
research is exploding, and there, if you look on Web of Science and see how many articles, use the term microplastics, it's exploding. And one of the examples during the workshop this morning was that since they stopped collecting data for this tox screening tool that they've created in April, there have been 7 or 8 more studies on mammals that have come out. So that level of growth is hard to keep up with. And as a researcher, it's like drinking water out of a fire hose, because you every day you can open up and search for new studies, and you just find all this stuff. The key is, how do you know if that study was done right? And I think journal editors are getting better at teasing out and rejecting the studies that aren't as rigorous. And so some of the older studies that you might find in literature are not as reliable or would not be accepted today. So you have to also tease that out. But for the most part, anything coming out today should be more rigorous and have great standards that allow us to better compare across studies.
Wow. So earlier you talked about population effects, and I'm not sure, but are you familiar with Dr. Shauna Swan by chance?
I'm not.
So I caught an interview that featured her on actually Joe Rogan's podcast. And if anyone is interested, please look that up on YouTube, because it's very interesting. But wow, she did multiple studies just based on phthalates. And that came from, or that come from the petrochemical industry. And she and her colleagues have proven that this is a chemical found in all of our foods and drinks that affect our hormones and development. We're not even just talking about fish, we're talking about grains and everything that we can ingest. And it affects our hormones and development, specifically testosterone levels developing in young boys from their pregnant mothers. And it's also directly tied into our sperm counts and infertility. And she proved that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I have a question for you. Is this phthalates or perfluorinated compounds?
This is phthalates. Yeah, but
okay.
She did it specifically on phthalates.
Okay.
But then she said she alluded that, like, since we've shown direct correlations, there are definitely other chemicals that are doing this, but we found direct correlation that this is affecting our infertility and our hormones. So she proved that a lower AGD or an anogenital distance, or informally taint length, directly correlates with these chemicals found in the environment, such as these phthalates. So Dr. Swan actually found this back in 2005, and then she also redid her research to make sure that she backed up her credibility, and she found it again in 2008. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know much about phthalates, but what you're describing there also is similar to what's known about perfluorinated compounds, which are these compounds that are used in a lot of things to they're basically surfactants. And so on fast food wrappers, when you peel the cheese off of a hamburger wrapper, it just comes right off. That's because it's lined with a little bit of plastic, I believe, but also this chemical, these perfluorinated compounds. Stainmaster carpets, which were probably still around today, but back in the 80s, you could find that label, and that was like what you wanted because your carpet wouldn't stain. Well, that's a chemical in the perfluorinated compound family, and those are very similar to what you're saying with sperm rates and their sperm counts, and they're everywhere. In fact, there's a great documentary called "The Devil We Don't Know," and I think it's available free on YouTube, or at least it was, where you can buy it, about perfluorinated compounds in West Virginia that kind of have the same effect. And after World War II is when these compounds really took off, and 3M and DuPont made them, and others do now, I think. But some lawsuits started to pop up, and so those companies started doing research, and they couldn't find anybody in the U.S. that did not have it in their bloodstream. And so they had to go back to blood samples that the military took before World War II to do comparisons, because those blood samples before World War II did not have blood, or did not have the perfluorinated compounds in their blood. And phthalates, it's what you're saying sounds similar. I don't know if it's exactly the same, but these perfluorinated compounds are in firefighting foams, and they're in groundwater under a lot of military bases. So there's going to be tens to hundreds of billions of dollars worth of remediation for these perfluorinated compounds in the future, and similar amounts of lawsuits.
Wow. Wow. That's scary. That really is scary.
Yeah, that's another podcast for you.
It is.
They're PFAS compounds.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I actually know somebody that studies that. I'm gonna do a spin-off episode on that. I'm very, very interested. Wow. Yeah. So hey, I hate to cut it short, Jeremy, and I know you said you had to get out of here for another meeting, but this was such a pleasure having you on. Hopefully we can have you on again in the future, and we appreciate your time here. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. When we return for the final segment, Maysa Albahri and I will be discussing ways in which we, the consumers, can mitigate our daily consumption of plastics without hurting our pocketbooks. So stay tuned. Welcome back to the final segment of Woke Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Stanford. I have with me Maysa Albahri, electrical engineering student studying sustainable power systems at Western Sydney University in Australia. So as mentioned before, she is an active advocate of climate change, along with appropriate action towards a sustainable future. So welcome to the podcast, Maysa.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks for getting me here.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this final segment, we plan to cover ways in which we, the consumers, can mitigate our plastic consumption to save our planet and prevent long-term health effects on all living things. So Maysa, what are some ways in which we can decrease our daily consumption of plastics in a practical manner without kind of affecting our pocketbooks?
I think it's different from person to another, depends on your daily routine. So I'll share the way I started this, like reducing the single-use plastic in my life. So first thing, I just wrote down my daily routine and figured out which part of it have a single-use plastic. For example, I wake up in the morning and I go have my coffee at uni. And the coffee cups actually is not recyclable at all. So I replaced this with an eco-friendly cup. And yeah, that was the first thing I started with. Also my water bottle.
Nice.
I replaced it because I take my water bottle to uni. So I replaced it with a reusable water bottle. And this way I started just like looking at my daily routine and replacing everything that is single use with something that is reusable.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's amazing how much like out in our daily routine is actually plastic. And if you don't sit down and make that list, you don't realize it. I mean,
Yeah,
it's in our bathrooms, it's in our kitchens, it's in our bedrooms, it's everywhere. It's our
it's everywhere.
cars, whatever we got going on, there's some sort of plastics involved. And I like the list idea. I think I should do that, honestly. I mean, I've done a really good job in terms of trying to go zero waste, but that's a perfect idea. So thanks.
Yeah. And look, I'll just give an advice. Just don't go hard on yourself. For example, I have a fossil fuel car still because I can't afford the EV car. So
Mhm.
I still use it. So don't say if I can't do everything, then I'm not doing anything. Just
Very true.
start simple and then go like, and you can develop day by day.
Right. We don't need 100 people doing zero waste. We need millions of people doing it, imperfectly. We need people trying. It's not we don't expect people to go zero waste tomorrow. There's just no way. Like what we talked about in segment one, it's a producer and kind of governmental issue. I mean, yeah, I mean, we have a little bit of fault, but by no means anywhere near producers and I guess governments that implement education. So yeah, what like do you mind walking me through how, because I know we talked about offset, how the recycling system's set up? Maybe we can kind of help people understand like how to recycle better.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about this. So see, when I used to be like when I used to be a single use plastic person, I used to think every time I say the triangular symbol, which is the green one, I used to think, oh, it's recyclable, so it's good. And then when I actually did my research, it's not. And like not every time we see this on a product, that means the product is recyclable. It's only number 1 and 2. When we see number 1 and 2 inside it, it's easy to be recyclable. Other than that, it needs like specific programs to be recyclable, which is crazy. I would just give like a very small hints about the numbers. For example, number 1, we can find it in soda, water, juice bottles, and sometimes in food packaging. And we can recognize it that it doesn't have a color. And this is the most recyclable one. Number 2, which is HDPE. It's most found in milk jugs and household carpet cleaners, detergent containers, and some plastic bags. And this one is also recyclable. In Australia, actually, there's a program called Red Cycle is recycling this kind of plastic. From number 3, 4, and 5, it becomes harder to be recyclable. It's recyclable still, and a lot of programs, they do recycle it, but it becomes harder and harder. Reaching to number 6, which contains the coffee cups. And I think everyone around the world consume coffee daily. And it's not recyclable at all. It's the hardest to be recyclable with the egg cartons. And number 7 is the last one, which is the mixed plastic. And recycling programs, I wouldn't say 100%, but most of them, they don't prefer to recycle the mixed plastic.
Oh no, yeah, that's extremely difficult. And even some of the food packaging aren't even virgin plastics, like what you were talking about in number 1 and 2. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's a higher percentage for sure, where they have a concentration of highest being, HDPE or polypropylene or what have you. But it's pretty tough. It's what 9% globally in which we actually recycle these materials. But just kind of jumping back into some of these numbers, like with 1s and 2s, like water bottles, plastic grocery bags, and then getting into the HDPE with your detergent and milk bottles and stuff like that. All of that stuff is actually and easily, you can actually get away from those. You can find them in, like, you can find different alternatives in stores. It pretty much any store now, like in terms of just trying to get away from milk jugs. You can go anywhere locally and find something in a carton or in a glass jar. Like I actually, whenever I was drinking milk before I turned pescatarian, I was going to a local coffee shop that actually got fresh milk in glass jars from a local farm. It was really awesome. So I was doing it that way to mitigate waste. Now, in terms of the plastic bottles, you know, I don't recommend anybody drinking out of bottles, or out of plastic bottles. But what you can do is bring your own bottle. Go to any store; they're literally on every shelf. There's thousands of them on any shelf, and in any type of material too. I'm a big fan of Yeti. I buy a lot of Yeti products. So definitely shout out to Yeti there. Please endorse me. but yeah, there's a lot of different alternatives. And in terms of coffee cups, I know just from the American perspective that Americans drink up to 20 different coffee cups per week. And that actually is equating to over 1,000 cups in a year. And that's the average. Obviously, you know, we have 383 million people, but not everybody drinks coffee. But that's a big number. And actually, I was kind of surprised that America is only 11th in consumption per capita. I was really, really surprised by that. But for the percentage that do drink coffee in the US, that accrues to about 140 billion to-go cups per year. I can't tell you what that is volumetrically, but it's massive. I think it swallows the Empire State Building a few times, but I would tell you to look that YouTube video up. And but the cool thing is if we're talking money, which I mean, money kind of governs most decisions unless it's ethics. But money, you know, making your own, actually, I make my own coffee, and it's estimated that you save an average around $400 of savings per year, which is actually, it's pretty good. Put $400 back in your pocket. That's a nice plane ticket to anywhere in the US and sometimes globally. But I don't, you know, here's the problem. You know, cups are really wasteful. With every cup, there comes a lid, there comes a creamer cup, there comes a plastic straw, and other things behind the counter that we don't even realize. The milk containers, whatever it may be that you put in your coffee. And I do have a thing for coffee, and I love to support small businesses. So here's kind of my pitch for a happy middle ground. You know, unlike Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, you know, other like these chain coffee shops, you know, I don't mean to hate on who, you know, what you support, but the smaller coffee establishments, you know, they will listen to your suggestions. I've talked to many different ones in the local Pittsburgh area, and they've been very, you know, transparent in what they're trying to do. A lot of them are trying to be sustainable, and just giving them some ideas. So like just non-plastic alternatives. You can do cardboard cups. You can sit down with a mug, which is great. If you have, I mean, what does it take to drink a cup of coffee? 15 minutes, maybe. Out of a day, that's nothing. And then I've also mentioned edible cups to a lot of companies. Edible cups can be made from like different oats and grains compressed, and they actually have a pretty decent thermal capabilities in which they can, I think I saw anywhere up to like 8 hours in which they can hold heat. Plus it's edible, which is awesome.
Yeah.
And then also just bringing your own cup. I mean, that's the number one. I mean, post-COVID, I still do it within COVID, but post-COVID, I think that's the way to move. But so yeah, that's your pro tip for coffee lovers. What else can you think of? That way, you know, I don't steal the thunder.
I think it's all about consistency. Like if I buy a coffee cup today that is eco-friendly, and if I'm lazy to take it every day with me, or if I say, okay, today I'll buy a coffee cup, it's not going to affect much. It's all about consistency. It's all about caring about the planet, like caring and knowing what's happening. If you actually get this coffee cup, it's going to be emitting carbon, and it's going to be ruining the planet soon. Yeah. So I would say it's all about knowing. First of all, know why you don't want to get this coffee cup, because some people just like don't know why. once you know why, and once you know how much these coffee cups are affecting and emitting carbon to the environment, you would actually stop it. Like it's affecting your future. And if you have a family, it's affecting your family and your loved ones. So it's all about caring, knowing, and consistency.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
I agree. Yeah. Cheers. Yeah, no, speaking of coffee. But and I also kind of want to throw out a couple more ideas in which we can mitigate that I was kind of thinking of. And we kind of talked about consumer products, you know, in terms of just like, you know, drinking milk and coffee and water. But I mean, there's a lot more. Even in the bathroom, your toiletries, right? You think about your soaps, definitely, you know, from your hand soaps to what you use in the shower in terms of shampoos, conditioners, bar soaps is the way to go. I've switched over to cold form soaps. There's a lot of companies out there that are making organically made cold form soaps. A lot of small businesses too. I mean, if you go to like local farmers markets and stuff like that, they're there, which is really cool. And honestly, if you sit down and do the math in terms of usage compared to what you get in a bottle, it's quite similar. I mean, just in segment one, whenever I was talking to Greg Dayley, he is the owner of C-Bar, and C-Bar is a cold form soap company. And it's astonishing. We talked even on set that like the comparison of what you buy and what you get from each product is not even close. Like when you buy a shampoo from a bottle, you're buying 80% water, 20% soap. Whereas if you buy, it's actually just a scam. It really is a scam. I encourage everybody to try to get cold form soaps because you get way more out of the bar itself. And even in deodorants and stuff, like I wear Old Spice, and Old Spice actually has cardboard contained, you know, it's like a push pop kind of for deodorant. There's ways in which we can get around these things. Even with detergents, you mentioned detergents. I use, so you can buy Tide in 1,000 different plastic or probably HDPE containers, but they also have a sustainable product in which you can buy it in a box, which is really neat. And it's powder in a box, and I use that. They're huge. I mean, it's lasted me for maybe at least 4 months between like 2 to 3 people here at our apartment, which is really, really cool. There's so many different alternatives out there. I mean, you just kind of have to get informed, like what we're doing right now, get informed about it, and then just make it a daily routine. I mean, it doesn't take much, I don't think. Then it just becomes, just like how you're using plastic today, it becomes an unconscious act every other day. So
true.
Yeah.
And it takes like 21 days to take a habit. If you repeat something for 21 days, it will become part of your routine. That's a fact that I learned. Oh, yeah. And also, like just mentioning about shampoo and like soaps, there's always a green replacement, always, in everything. And Bill Gates in his book about climate change, he mentioned about green premiums. Even if it's a little bit costly or a little bit more expensive than the normal product, it's called a green premium because you're saving a planet at the end of the day. So and always like green, I say.
Right, and just like how I brought up, and I just wanted to make it known that a lot of these products, if you actually sit down and think about the worth between what the product is, if it's a green product, and then these petrol products that you use, technically, once we start, like we even talked about this in segment 1, and I'll repeat it, if you sit down and do the actual economic math between both, the petrol products usually use way more water and has more carbon put into it, right? So if we introduce a carbon tax and start actually valuing water, the difference in price is going to be not even close, like in terms of the green solution. So just getting into the habit now is going to save you a boatload of money in the future. Mark my words. I know it's coming. I mean, we have droughts popping up all over the world right now in terms of, natural fresh water. So definitely start getting into your habits now. I mean, 21 days isn't much in the grand scheme of life. It really isn't. A minute decision is nothing in the grand scheme of life.
Sure, 100%. I agree.
So thanks, Maysa, for that insight. I'm sure the listeners will benefit from the tips and tricks to reduce their plastic intakes, and then also kind of understand what's going on with our recycling system. So now I'll leave you with one final piece of info before we get out of here, which is actually really exciting. And so scientists all around the world are working diligently to find an answer to the plastic products that are already produced. And from my own research, they have found organisms that actually break down plastic. And that doesn't constitute that we go use more. It's just what's already been produced since the introduction of these petrol products. And these organisms are, so you have waxworms and mealworms. And on a microbial level, Ideonella saikiensis have all shown promise as plastic consuming organisms, which is really exciting. Like I said, this doesn't excuse us from producing less amounts of plastics, but in turn, it gives us a solution to what we are already facing. So remember, taking action is going to help the environment we live in, our own health, and then the health of other living organisms. And that will continue to give us opportunity to thrive on this beautiful planet that we call home. So thanks again, Maysa. It was a pleasure. I really like talking to you. I hope that we can do something else in the future.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks for inviting me and letting me be part of your podcast. It was amazing. Thanks.
That is all for this episode of Woke Talk Podcast. Now I'd like to give a big shout out to my guest stars for sharing their wealth of knowledge and vast expertise. I would also love to mention my amazing team here at Woke Talk Podcast, starting with Cody Brandt, our senior editor, David Beam for being my co-producer and graphic designer. You can find him on Instagram at DavidBeam37 or at DavidBeam on Twitter. And last but definitely not least, Panyapit Eriksit, our social media coordinator. You can find him on Instagram at Panyapit_U. To wrap up, we hope that you take away important information in regards to how plastics affect the world we live in and what we can do to mitigate the plastics we consume without digging deeper into our pockets. To find out more information, please visit the Ecology Center at ecologycenter.org. The Ecology Center is celebrating their 51st anniversary this year and is known as one of the first action-oriented environmental organizations in the United States. The Ecology Center was founded on the ideology of establishing environmental problems and in demonstrating sound alternatives. Their website contains fact sheets, brochures, and a help desk that can support your questions and curiosities on climate, the environment, sustainability, and much more. So say if you wanted to learn more about how you can cut single-use plastics, they can help with that. They have a plastic-free blog on their website called Zero Waste News, just for you to get involved with or even just read up on. So check out their website at ecologycenter.org for this important information, or find them on Facebook at ecologycenter.org, Twitter at ecologycenter, or Instagram at ecology.center. Woke Talk Podcast would like to encourage you to invoke change in our society and make it an effort to make this world a more sustainable place. We need leaders to protect our ecosystems for the survival of future generations. So just remember, change does start with you. So thank you all for listening to Woke Talk Podcast. I am your host, Sam Stanford. And as always, stay woke.
Woke Talk Podcast would like to give a shout out to Anchor by Spotify for sponsoring our podcast, along with Ben Sound Music for providing our show with intro, outro, and advertisement background rhythm.